poverty, for example? Should you have to pay for road closures and stewarding the crowds? The Metropolitan Police has told groups such as the Campaign Against Climate Change that they, as demonstrators, will have to foot the bill for something that police officers used to do as part of their duties. Fair enough, you might think. However, the Campaign Against Climate Change, which is planning a protest in London on the 7th of March, say they can't afford the cost of hiring a private security firm and organising road closures. It's thought that the bill for this could reach at least £10,000. Campaigners see the new policy as an infringement on their right to demonstrate. The Metropolitan Police says it will, of course, step in if there's a risk of any crime taking place, but it doesn't want to use its budget to provide a traffic management plan or stewarding for a peaceful private event. So where do your sympathies lie? The number 0500 288 291. And joining me in the studio, Jamie Kelsey-Fry, contributing editor for the New Internationalist magazine. Hello, Jamie. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
So you can see why, can't you, if it's a privately held demonstration and there's unlikely to be any kind of criminal activity, the Met Police is saying, you know, we don't want to be the people to guide you along the route. If you choose to protest, you have to fork out for it.
I can see why. I can see there's a logic of sorts behind it, but it's a much more important way of looking at it is this is an actual an attack on democracy itself. The right to protest is enshrined in British law, so taking this away is an attack on one of the fundamentals of British society itself. You know, if you agree, the people listening, you have to come out on any of these three demonstrations on March the 7th. Million Women Rise, Campaign Against Climate Change, Occupy Democracy. If you disagree with what the police are trying to do, you need to show your disagreement by actually taking part in them. But this is actually part of basic British culture, the right to protest. So it's an attack on our democracy itself, the way that I see it. I understand the police saying we are absolutely stretched. We need to make sure that because of the cuts, we still make sure justice is done. I absolutely respect that. As all your listeners know, a police officer could save your life tonight, and that's incredibly important. But there's a very strong reason, if you look at the history of protests in this country, to say that actually protesters are often fighting for justice themselves by taking action. So to take that away from them, and that's what you're doing by making them pay, then you're actually taking away another way that the British public ensure justice is done.
But you might say we have the right to protest wherever we want to, whenever we want to, but we don't have the right to protest entirely free of charge. If we're going to need some stewarding, if we're going to need some navigating, if we're going to need some road closures, then we should have to stump up. And if we believe in the cause, we should get our protesters to shell out a few quid to contribute so that those who don't believe in the cause don't indirectly have to pay for it via taxation.
That's interesting, but the idea of the protesters shelling out so they can speak up for their cause, a lot of protests, which I think is completely valid protests, particularly now under the current government, for example, 1 million people going to food banks, how can they pay to stand up for themselves? You have a situation in London at the moment where the entire city is being gentrified. So people are being thrown out of their social housing, not because they can't pay their rent, but they're being thrown out of the social housing because the local councils want to sell those flats for millions of pounds. So to say that for them to stand up for their rights, they need to pay to do that, they can't afford to, you know.
Let me bring in Graham Taylor on this. He's an author, former police officer. Graham Taylor, you know, by this token, would the Jarrow March ever have occurred if people have to pay to have their marches stewarded?
See, the thing is that people don't have to pay to march. What the Metropolitan Police is very sensibly doing is saying, look, if you're organising a large event within London and it's a peaceful, well-organised event, which many of these are, please would you contribute towards the cost of policing? If it was a football match, if it was a pop concert, if it was some other event like that, if it was BBC proms in the park, the organisers would be contributing towards the policing. Mm-hmm. We still have the right for spontaneous protest in this country. We still can gather in Trafalgar Square and demonstrate. And with the poll tax riots, you know, we can still gather and say we do not like a particular thing. But when it comes to well-organised events, which all the ones mentioned are, then there needs to be some contribution towards policing and towards road closures. The trouble with the Metropolitan Police is they have to pay for so much out of their budget. They're paying millions of pounds a year to look after a man called Assange who's hiding away in an embassy. It's costing an absolute fortune. And it's a drain when they're wanting to fight crime. It's a drain. So any help towards a policing budget, it would be gratefully accepted.
OK, that's some really good points, Graham, and I really appreciate them. First of all, though, let's get something very basic for the listeners. Who's made this decision? Because if it's the London Met, I think it's important to make clear to the public who are the police force answerable to. That's really important.
What's the answer?
Please answer that first.
What do you mean? Why are you asking the question?
Well, Graham will know because he's been a serving police officer.
Well, the police are actually answer to we're publicly, locally appointed citizens who are directly answerable to the people who appoint us. So as a police officer, you are answerable to the people who appoint you. You're answerable to as a Met officer, to everybody who lives in London, and you police by their consent. This is not a police state.
But there's no public consent for this.
We police by the consent of the public.
But there's no public consent for this decision the Met have made. You're answerable to the public, okay, who you serve, and the Home Secretary. So if the Home Secretary is involved in this, I think that'd be really important to know. I doubt she would be, because at the moment her party are known as the Nasty Party. So it looks like to me the Met have made this decision themselves without any recourse to the people who they are serving, who they are answerable to, which is the people. So how can they do that?
I think the main issue is, in the glory days, when the Met and police forces up and down the country were being properly funded, this wasn't a problem. And they could quite happily go along and police for free lots of events.
Well, that's right.
But because the Tory government is cutting and cutting and cutting budgets, not just in the police force, but throughout the country, it is actually making it that they're now having to think of ways of policing and asking people to pay. And it's a very, very sad situation, but this is where we are. Once you bring in the free market economy into public services, then somewhere somebody's got to pay, and this is what's going to happen with the Met.
No, you've gone from it's a very frightening future for the police force in the way that you're describing it. I absolutely agree. But, you know, where does the money come from is a really important thing as well. I mean, you can't really say that because of the cuts, you know, protesters are going to have to pay, when in fact a lot of protests are about the cuts. It just doesn't add up at all. You know,
this is the irony of the current political situation. That
but don't make us pay then.
Cutting.
Yeah, but the police shouldn't be making us pay for that then, should they?
If we're totally fighting on your side, the reality is, if we want peaceful demonstrations where people feel protected and safe to demonstrate, because this is a key thing, a lot of the time when I was a police officer, you spend time actually protecting the demonstrators, actually protecting the person's right to demonstrate, because there are some very, very nasty people out there who would like to stop some of these demonstrations. You may know some of these right-wing organisations that would love to stop freedom of speech.
Yeah, sometimes absolutely.
And the police spend a lot of time protecting.
But those marches on Saturday aren't doing that, though. Those marches on Saturday are pretty clear-cut. One is, 1 Million Rising. That's actually a very peaceful march. They're both very peaceful, about the fact addressing abuse of women globally. The other one's about climate change, the biggest threat this human species has ever known. And the third one is Occupy Democracy in Parliament Square, that is challenging exactly the kind of things we're talking about.
May I ask Graham a question? Graham, is it possible to stage a demonstration that doesn't cost much money? I mean, if, for example, you stand still instead of walking, or you sit down instead of standing, or you choose a particular place that doesn't actually break up the traffic. I mean, is there a way of staging a cheaper demo than just simply marching from one place to another?
Absolutely. Occupy Trafalgar Square. If people were going to go into Trafalgar Square and just sit down, peacefully protest, not make any sort of problems with the traffic, not make any sort of problems with the passes of members of the public, then that's fine. It is very, very cheap to police.
Okay.
It is when we have large bodies of people moving great distances and causing traffic problems, especially in central London, that is when there needs to be an integrated traffic policy. That's when there needs to be road closures.
Let me put this then to Jamie here. Everything in life has to be paid for by somebody in some shape or form. Everyone pays for every basic right. We pay for shelter, we pay for food. Of course, we pay for basic rights ultimately. But people have to structure the way they live and the way they behave to what they can afford. So you've just heard from Graham there that a nice cheap protest, which everyone can take part in, without having to contribute much at all, if anything whatsoever, is to go and sit down in Trafalgar Square.
Good.
So why don't we just, cut your coat according to our cloth and decide not to go marching through London, but sit still and then you can have as many people as you like rallying there, and you can make exactly what you want to make it, the point you want to make it, put it over.
But he's deeply mistaken, and it's very misrepresentational of what Graham has just said.
Why is he mistaken?
I'll tell you. Once a month, Occupy Democracy, go to that square, Parliament Square, and the police have been absolutely abhorrent in their behaviour. It's easy to look it up. Boris Jonson, through Freedom of Information Act we found out, has spent £250,000 absolutely demonising about 50 people who
I think he was talking about Trafalgar Square, not Parliament Square.
No, Parliament Square. We're there once a month. Someone was arrested for having an empty pizza box. Why do you think that might be, Vanessa? Because it was construed as being camping equipment, OK? And a number of people were arrested for standing on tarpaulin, OK? 15 police officers were told to go round all night, and if anyone was keeping their eyes closed for too long a period of time, they can be arrested for sleeping. You know, it's absolutely ridiculous to say that people who are taking non-marching, small protests, they're absolutely left to do that. No, they're demonised. The more close to the truth you get, the more demonised the police are going to be.
Let's ask Graham. Graham, is this true?
Some of that, sadly, some of what this gentleman said is actually true.
Thank you for saying that.
This is a problem. The policing in London does need to change its attitude towards protesters. We do have a right to protest, and a peaceful protest should be allowed to take place, and Boris should not be spending that amount of money making it difficult for people to protest. They don't cause any problem, they don't cause any heartache, they're usually peaceful, quite verbal, they're not a problem, and they should be left to get on with it.
I really appreciate you saying, Graham. There's a very important thing that the listeners, I'm sure, have thought about already. What will happen if this is allowed to go ahead? You know, I think you've probably said in the story already, but the people who are organising the demonstrations on March the 7th, they've said we're not going to pay. Now, let's say that eventually someone will pay. When we get to November the 11th, Armistice Day, we're going to make the veterans pay for them going on their march. When Cameron, the Prime Minister, David Cameron, was over in Paris, very important, like all the world leaders were there talking about the freedom of expression. How would he feel if after he went on that demonstration in Paris, the cops came up to him and said, and here's your bill, mate, for going on that demo? I mean, this is absolutely absurd.
Jamie, thank you very much indeed. So thanks to Jamie Kelsey Friday, thanks to Graham Taylor. We're taking calls from you on this 0500 288 291.